Everyone knows the moon landing happened, or rather, almost everyone knows the moon landing happened. A significant minority believe it was faked. A much larger majority believe they know the basic story. Kennedy, astronauts, rocket, moon, flag, return. Both groups are wrong about something important. The majority who know it happened tend to understand it as a clean story of national triumph. America decided to go to the moon. America built the rocket. America sent the men. The men landed. The men came home. End. What actually happened was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more dependent on individual courage, individual ingenuity, and individual luck than the triumphalist narrative suggests. There were at least 3 moments on July 20th, 1969, alone, before the landing, when the mission should have failed, when it nearly did fail, when the margin between success and catastrophe was measured not in design tolerances, but in split-second decisions made by people who had perhaps 15 seconds to make them. The moon landing was not a clean story of national triumph. It was a series of near disasters held together by extraordinary competence, extraordinary courage, and a handful of people who refused to give up when the instruments told them things that should have been, by any prior understanding, impossible. This episode is the story of what actually happened on those 8 days in July 1969. Not the version you know, the version that happened. Apollo 11 did not begin in 1969. It began in the rubble of Apollo 1. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed when a fire broke out in their command module during a ground test at Cape Kennedy. The fire was fed by pure oxygen, the atmosphere used in the spacecraft, and spread with extraordinary speed in the closed capsule. All 3 were dead within seconds. The investigation that followed was devastating. The fire had been caused by a spark in wiring that ran through the spacecraft, wiring that was poorly installed, badly routed, and in some places damaged during assembly. The investigation found that the capsule had been delivered by the manufacturer, North American Aviation, in a condition that was, by any reasonable standard, unacceptable. 18,000 open engineering discrepancy reports remained unresolved at the time of the fire. The entire Apollo program was grounded. The command module was redesigned. The management culture at NASA and its contractors was overhauled. New quality control procedures were implemented. It took 21 months before any American flew in space again. The deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee are not usually given the prominence they deserve in the public narrative of Apollo. They were the program's darkest moment, and they were also, in the cold calculus of engineering, the moment that made the moon landing possible. The fire forced a redesign that made the spacecraft significantly safer. The investigation found and fixed problems that might otherwise have killed a crew in flight. The 3 men who died on the launch pad in January 1967 are, in a very real sense, part of the reason that Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins came home. To understand what Apollo 11 actually did, you need to understand what it was. The mission consisted of 3 spacecraft. The command module, Columbia, was the conical capsule in which the 3 astronauts lived for most of the journey. It was roughly 11 cubic meters of habitable space, smaller than the interior of a modern compact car. Attached to the command module was the service module, an unpressurized cylinder containing the main propulsion system, fuel cells that generated electricity, and supplies of oxygen and hydrogen. The command and service modules together were the vehicle in which the astronauts traveled to the moon and back. Separately, carried in the nose of the Saturn V during launch, was the lunar module, Eagle. This was the vehicle that would actually land on the moon. It consisted of two parts, a descent stage, which served as the lower half of the spacecraft and the landing platform, and an ascent stage, which was the crew compartment and the vehicle that would lift off from the moon and return the astronauts to Columbia in lunar orbit. The lunar module had one ascent engine. One. There was no backup. If the engine failed to fire after landing, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon. There was no rescue vehicle. There was nothing that could be done. This was understood before the mission. The astronauts understood it. Mission Control understood it. The engineers who designed the engine understood it. The single-point failure was accepted because the weight and complexity penalties of a backup engine were prohibitive. The engine had to work. It did. But it was always one of the facts that lived in the background of everything that happened on the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong was 38 years old when he stepped onto the moon. He was a former naval aviator and test pilot who had flown 78 combat missions in Korea, become a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and flown the X-15 experimental aircraft to the edge of space before joining NASA. He was selected as commander of Apollo 11 not because he was the most famous astronaut or the most senior, but because he was considered the right person for the job by the people who were making the decision. He was cool, technically gifted, quietly thoughtful, and possessed of a quality that the astronaut corps recognized and valued. He did not panic under pressure. This quality would be tested on July 20th in ways that no simulation had fully prepared him for. Buzz Aldrin was a West Point graduate with a doctorate in orbital mechanics from MIT. He had flown in the Gemini program and conducted the first productive spacewalk by an American astronaut. Previous spacewalks had been difficult and exhausting, but Aldrin had been trained methodically and executed his precisely. He was competitive, technically brilliant, and somewhat prone to the kind of self-promotion that the stoic culture of the astronaut corps found slightly uncomfortable. He had wanted to be the first to step on the moon. The decision to make Armstrong as commander, the first to exit the spacecraft, was made before the mission, without, by most accounts, extensive consultation with Aldrin. He accepted it. He did not entirely forgive it for a long time. Michael Collins had been assigned to fly the command module in lunar orbit, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface. He accepted this role with a serenity that was genuine rather than resigned. He would be alone in Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon. Alone in a way that no human being had ever been. On the far side of the moon, with no communication with Earth, with no way to help if something went wrong on the surface. He described this experience as peaceful rather than frightening. He was aware of how unusual this made him among people capable of feeling things. Apollo 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center, Launch Complex 39A, at 9:32 a.m. on July 16, 1969. The Saturn V's 5 F1 engines ignited. The hold-down clamps released, the rocket began to rise. The Saturn V was 111 meters tall. At liftoff, with a full load of propellants, it weighed approximately 2.8 million kilograms, more than 6 million pounds. The 5 first-stage engines generated 34.5 million newtons of thrust. The rocket cleared the launch tower in about 12 seconds and cleared the 100-meter mark in about 15. The launch was watched by an estimated 1 million people along the Florida coast. an estimated 600 million watched on television worldwide, the largest television audience in history to that point. The first stage burned for approximately 2.5 minutes. It was jettisoned at an altitude of about 67 kilometers. The second stage burned for approximately 6 minutes. The third stage placed the spacecraft in a parking orbit around the Earth, where the systems were checked for approximately 2.5 hours. Then, the third stage reignited for a translunar injection burn, the maneuver that sent Apollo 11 from Earth orbit toward the Moon. The spacecraft separated from the third stage. Collins performed a transposition and docking maneuver, extracting the lunar module from the nose of the third stage. The journey to the Moon had begun. The journey took approximately 3 days. The crew performed occasional course corrections, observed the Earth and Moon through their windows, slept in shifts, and conducted the television broadcasts that the networks aired with varying enthusiasm. Space travel, once the violence of launch was past, was largely quiet and methodical. On July 19th, Apollo 11 performed its lunar orbit insertion burn, entering orbit around the Moon. On the morning of July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module. Collins sealed the hatch. They were alone. The powered descent to the lunar surface took approximately 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes contained more concentrated drama than most people's entire lives. The lunar module's descent engine ignited at an altitude of approximately 15 kilometers above the lunar surface. The engine performed a powered descent, not a free fall, but a controlled, continuous burn that slowed the spacecraft from its orbital velocity of approximately 1.6 kilometers per second to the slow hover above the landing site. The computer controlling the descent, the Apollo guidance computer, a machine with roughly as much processing power as a modern cheap pocket calculator, was running multiple programs simultaneously, controlling the engine, calculating the trajectory, monitoring the navigation, communicating with Earth through the antenna. At approximately 7 minutes into the powered descent, at an altitude of roughly 8 kilometers, an alarm sounded. The display showed 1202. Armstrong called Houston. Program alarm, it's a 1202. In the mission notes, 1202 was listed as an alarm that could occur if the guidance computer was overloaded. But it had never occurred in any simulation. No one at Mission Control had encountered a 1202 alarm in a live descent. At Mission Control in Houston, a 26-year-old flight controller named Jack Garman had, by fortunate coincidence, prepared a handwritten list of computer alarms before the mission, noting which ones were acceptable to fly through and which required aborting the landing. He had prepared this list on his own initiative, not because anyone asked him to. The 1202 was on his list. It was acceptable to fly through as long as the alarm was intermittent rather than continuous, as long as the computer was recovering each time rather than crashing permanently. Flight Director Gene Kranz asked his guidance officer, Steve Bales, for a call. Bales asked Garman. Garman checked his list. "It's go," Garman said. Bales told Kranz, "We're go on that alarm." Kranz passed it to the crew. They were go. The 1202 alarm kept firing. 6 times during the descent, the computer cried for help. Each time, the assessment was the same. The computer was recovering. The navigation data was good. The guidance was accurate. They were go. But there was another problem developing that the alarms had obscured. The automatic guidance system was flying the lunar module toward a landing site that had been selected from orbital photographs. What the photographs had not shown, what no one knew, was that the target area contained a large crater, roughly the size of a football stadium, filled with rocks the size of cars. Armstrong could see this through the window. The automatic guidance system was going to land the lunar module in that crater. At an altitude of about 150 meters, with approximately 90 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong did something that the training had prepared him for, but that no simulation had fully reproduced. He took manual control. He flew the lunar module across the crater. He was looking for a smooth area. Below him, the fuel was burning. At mission control, the guidance officer was calling out the fuel levels. 60 seconds. 45. 30. Forward. Forward. Good. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. 6. Down 1/2. These are the words of Charlie Duke, the Capcom at mission control, reading back the data being called down by the crew. The numbers were the altitude and descent rate. The fuel was almost gone. Contact light. One of the probes extending from the landing legs had touched the surface. Armstrong cut the engine. Shut down. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. There were 13 seconds of fuel remaining. 13 seconds. In a descent that had lasted 12 minutes. In a mission that had been planned for 8 years. In a program that had cost $24 billion. 13 seconds. After landing, there was a brief discussion about whether to rest before the surface activities or to proceed immediately. The original plan had called for a sleep period before the EVA, the extra-vehicular activity, the moonwalk. Armstrong and Aldrin asked to go early. They were ready. They were there. They were not going to sleep. The preparation for the moonwalk took approximately 2.5 hours, suiting up, depressurizing the cabin, checking systems, opening the hatch. Every step had to be done carefully in the cramped module, in spacesuits designed to protect them from the lunar environment, but not designed for comfort. Armstrong backed out through the hatch onto the small porch at the top of the ladder. He reached back, pulled a lanyard that deployed a fold-down camera, and descended slowly. Halfway down the ladder, he pulled a handle that opened the equipment storage bay, releasing the camera that would film his first steps. At the bottom of the ladder, he stepped onto the footpad of the descent stage and paused. "I'm going to step off the LM now." He stepped down. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The word "a," intended between "for" and "man," without which the sentence is a logical contradiction, was lost in the transmission. Armstrong insisted afterward that he had said it. The recording does not clearly capture it. Most historians give him the benefit of the doubt. He described the surface. The lunar soil was fine and powdery, like granulated gray charcoal. He could see clearly for some distance. The sky was black. The light was intense. There were no visual reference points on the horizon. He collected a contingency sample, a small bag of soil grabbed immediately in case the EVA had to be cut short, and then waited for Aldrin to join him. Aldrin descended the ladder and looked around. He said, "Magnificent desolation." Armstrong and Aldrin were on the lunar surface for approximately 2.5 hours. Of that time, roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes were spent outside the spacecraft. They planted the flag. They spoke to President Nixon, who called it the most historic telephone call ever made. They set up experiments, a seismometer to detect moonquakes, a laser retroreflector that scientists still use today to measure the distance to the moon with centimeter precision. They collected samples, 21.55 kilograms of lunar rocks and soil. Armstrong made a brief solo excursion to the edge of Little West Crater, about 60 meters from the lunar module, to photograph the interior. Aldrin photographed boot prints, the spacecraft, the equipment. Both of them photographed each other and the Earth, a blue marble hanging in the black sky. There is something worth sitting with in the midst of all this activity. Two human beings were standing on the surface of another world for the first time in the 4-billion-year history of life on Earth. The nearest other human being was 100 kilometers away in lunar orbit. The nearest other human being on Earth was 380,000 kilometers away. They were, in any spatial sense, more alone than any human beings had ever been. And they were doing careful, methodical, professional work. Setting up equipment, collecting samples, following the timeline. The gap between the magnitude of what they were doing and the routine manner in which they were doing it is perhaps the thing that makes the moon landing most remarkable. The ascent engine ignited at 1:54 p.m. on July 21st, 21 hours and 36 minutes after landing. The ascent stage lifted off from the descent stage, which served as a launch platform. The flag they had planted was blown over by the engine plume. The ascent to orbit, the rendezvous with Columbia, the docking, the transfer of crew and samples to the command module, the jettisoning of the lunar module, all of this was methodical and successful. Collins had been alone in lunar orbit for just under a day. He was, by his own description, glad to see them. The trans-Earth injection burn sent Apollo 11 back toward Earth. The 3-day return journey was uneventful. On July 24th, the command module, separated from the service module, re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, deployed its 3 main parachutes, and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean at 12:50 p.m. Hawaiian time. The USS Hornet was waiting. The astronauts were recovered by helicopter. They were placed in a quarantine facility, a concern about possible lunar contamination that subsequent experience showed was unnecessary, but which was taken seriously in 1969. 21 months after the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, 8 years after Kennedy's speech, 66 years after Tsiolkovsky published his rocket equation in a provincial Russian town. The decade was not yet out. Let us address directly and calmly the claim that the moon landing was faked. It was not faked. The evidence for this is overwhelming, multi-sourced, and includes both American and Soviet confirmation. Let me explain why. The Soviet Union had every possible incentive to expose a fake. The space race was geopolitical competition at its most intense. If the Americans had faked the moon landing and the Soviets knew it, revealing the fraud would have been the most devastating propaganda victory of the Cold War. The Soviets were tracking Apollo 11 with their own independent radar and radio facilities throughout the mission. They did not claim it was fake. The Soviet news agency TASS reported the landing as real. This alone should settle the question for most people. The bitterest rival the United States had in 1969 tracked the mission independently and did not dispute it. The retroreflectors that Armstrong and Aldrin placed on the lunar surface, precise arrays of mirrors designed to reflect laser beams back to Earth with high accuracy, are still there. Scientists and amateur astronomers around the world still bounce lasers off them today, measuring the precise distance to the moon. They could not have been placed there by an unmanned mission with the precision required for the laser ranging to work. The lunar samples, 382 kilograms of rocks collected over 6 Apollo surface missions have been analyzed by scientists in dozens of countries. They have chemical and isotopic compositions that are different from any rock on Earth and consistent with the formation history of the Moon. Meteorites from the Moon have been found in Antarctica and have matched the Apollo samples. There is no plausible mechanism by which a 1960s American government could have fabricated 382 kilograms of convincing alien rock. The Van Allen belt radiation objection. The claim that the astronauts would have died from radiation passing through the Earth's protective radiation belts is based on a misunderstanding of both the radiation dose and the exposure time. Apollo transited the belts quickly. The astronauts received a radiation dose comparable to a few chest X-rays. Their medical records are documented and available. The waving flag. The claim that a flag cannot wave in the vacuum of the Moon, therefore the film was shot in a studio, reflects a misunderstanding of what is shown. The flag is not waving in the wind. It has a horizontal rod along its top edge to keep it extended. The apparent movement is the residual oscillation from being planted in the absence of air resistance to damp it. It stops moving when the astronauts stop touching it. The moon landing conspiracy theory first gained significant traction with a book published in 1976 by Bill Kaysing, a former technical writer who worked for Rocketdyne, one of the companies that built Apollo engines. Kaysing had no scientific background and had left Rocketdyne before the Apollo program began. His book, We Never Went to the Moon, laid out the framework that most subsequent conspiracy theories have borrowed from.
The theory is not,
at this point, a scientific question. Every scientific objection has been thoroughly addressed. What the conspiracy theory represents is something other than a scientific dispute. A deep distrust of institutions, a sense that power conceals truth, a psychological need for a hidden explanation behind visible events. These feelings are understandable. The specific claim is false. Apollo 11 was not the only moon landing. It was the first. Apollo 12, in November 1969, landed with pinpoint precision within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 unmanned probe, which had been on the lunar surface for 2.5 years. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean collected samples and retrieved pieces of Surveyor 3 for analysis, demonstrating that components had been modified by their long exposure to the lunar environment. Apollo 13, in April 1970, is the mission most people know from the film. An oxygen tank in the service module exploded 56 hours into the flight. The command module lost power and oxygen. The crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, retreated to the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat. They used the lunar module's descent engine to correct their trajectory. They endured 4 days in a cold, cramped, resourced for 2 spacecraft with 3 people. They returned safely. The mission that did not land on the moon is in many ways the greatest demonstration of what the Apollo program was actually made of. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 all landed successfully. They visited different sites: the Fra Mauro Highlands, the Hadley Apennine Mountains, the Descartes Highlands, the Taurus Littrow Valley. They brought back increasingly diverse and scientifically valuable samples. Apollos 15, 16, and 17 carried lunar rovers, electric vehicles that allowed astronauts to explore much larger areas than they could on foot. The last man to walk on the moon, as of this writing, was Eugene Cernan of Apollo 17 in December 1972. He drove the rover to the rim of a large crater and took photographs. He climbed back into the lunar module. He did not make a speech, he just left. No human being has been back. The moon landing was not the story of a government that decided to do something and did it. It was the story of 400,000 people, engineers, mathematicians, machinists, test pilots, flight controllers, managers, seamstresses who sewed the spacesuits, welders who built the rocket, who were given a goal that most of them privately believed was impossible when they started, and who worked for 8 years until it wasn't. It was the story of 3 men who died in a fire on a launch pad in January 1967, whose deaths made the spacecraft safer. It was the story of a 26-year-old flight controller who made a handwritten list of computer alarms on his own initiative, and whose list was the reason the Eagle landed instead of aborting. It was the story of a commander who took manual control with 90 seconds of fuel remaining and flew his spacecraft over a crater full of boulders to find 13 seconds worth of landing space. It was the story of a program that began as a political maneuver in response to Soviet prestige and ended as something that genuinely extended the physical reach of our species beyond the planet we evolved on. It was achieved by human beings with slide rules and early computers, and courage, and occasionally extraordinary luck. And then it stopped, not because the technology failed, not because the destinations had been visited and the science had been done, because the political context that had motivated it, the Cold War urgency, the national humiliation of Soviet space triumphs, the specific personality of John F. Kennedy, had dissipated, and the money and attention had to go elsewhere. The moon is still there. The retroreflectors are still there. The descent stages of 6 lunar modules are still there, sitting on the surface of another world, having never moved since the day they landed. There is a footprint on the Sea of Tranquility. It is probably still there, undisturbed, because the moon has no weather to erode it. It is Neil Armstrong's footprint, or possibly Buzz Aldrin's. It has been there for 55 years. It will be there for 1,000,000 years. The moon does not forget what visits it.